What's up? I know we usually do these kinds of things at night, but let's just say I was feeling seasonal. It snowed outside. I thought it would be a nice change of pace. And besides, this isn't 3 a.m. soliloquies anyway. This is the inaugural episode at long last of the Spectrum of Catastrophe. Now, this is going to be a more special research-based show here on the channel. These days, with the fate of the world being constantly thrown into turmoil, I thought it would be especially appropriate, and maybe a little bit educational, to take a look at some of my favorite games, which just so happen to be centered largely around catastrophes. Now, your immediate inclination if you're a gamer is to probably go, okay, well that's every game ever made. And you're pretty much right. It's true, the phrases save the world or the fate of the universe hangs in the balance have become inevitable pop culture calling cards where fantasy games are concerned. For this show, though, I want to take a more focused look at some very specific games that use different types of catastrophes as a deliberate means of examining their real-world implications, but especially the soundtracks and other pertinent aspects of sound design that help them to do that. Now, if you watched the introductory video, you know the 6 games that we'll be taking a look at here. But if you didn't, that's fine too, because as opposed to one video on 2 games like I said I was gonna do, I'm instead starting with 2 videos on 1 game each. That's because this video ended up being way longer than I anticipated, but that's because there's a lot to talk about here. And just as well, since Death Stranding is not only the longest and probably the most unique game on this list, but also because its central premise is used to explore such a wide range of both grounded and fantastical themes. Everything from isolation and the importance of interpersonal relationships, to the horror and permanence of war, to the threat of nuclear annihilation, to the idea of humans being the greatest danger to themselves. Death Stranding's nearly 60-hour playtime gives it the pacing to explore all these themes in depth. And to do this many ideas justice, you need an equally nuanced soundtrack. So before we can talk about how sound design helps the game to do what it does, we need to talk about what it does. Well, what does it do?
Tell me, Sam, what does America mean to you?
To describe the game briefly, and I do mean briefly, since describing it more in depth would take hours, Death Stranding has the player take control of Sam Porter Bridges, played by Norman Reedus. After a mysterious event called the Death Stranding rocks the world and causes the dissolution of society at large, Sam is commissioned by the UCA, the new incarnation of the USA, to take this device called the Cupid across the country and rebuild a wireless network in order to reconnect everyone who was stranded by the Stranding. This is your primary goal, but you're also tasked by the dying president of the UCA on the East Coast, Bridget Strand, who happens to be your mom, to rescue your sister, Amelie, the heir to the presidency who's being held hostage by terrorists on the West Coast. This is the basic premise, and when described this way, the game doesn't seem all that complex. But that's only the science fiction side. When you involve the supernatural beats in your explanation, it gets so much crazier. The Stranding itself is this ghoulish disaster that blurred the lines between the waking world and the world of the dead, and that had all kinds of effects. For example, humans became aware of the true nature of life after death via this place called the Beach, which is essentially the in-between realm of our world and the other side, where the soul departs the body and crosses into the world of the dead. This is the natural process, but unfortunately, they only become aware of this because these ghostly, monstrous interlopers called beached things, or BTs, can cross the beach back into the real world, where they kill and wreak havoc. And to make matters even worse, this strange phenomenon called timefall starts happening, where precipitation from the beach causes things to move forward in time at an accelerated rate. Anything, living or inanimate. This means buildings fall apart faster, metal rusts quicker, birds die in midair when they get caught in storms, plants bloom and die under your feet, and the very landscape erodes at a faster rate. But like with anything, humans adapted. A secret government project produces these eerie babies called bridge babies, which allow their user a peek into the other side so they can see BTs and evade them accordingly. Bridge babies, also called BBs, are born from a still mother and therefore exist right on the line of life and death, and so connect living humans to the other side. More mysteriously, some people develop this strange condition called dooms that gives them new powers derived from the Stranding. For some people, that means they can sense BTs. For some people, it means they can teleport. Some can actually summon BTs. It all depends. For Sam, this means that not only can he return from the dead through this trippy mechanic called repatriation, but his blood is also fatal to BTs, and so Sam basically becomes the front line between humanity and the BTs, using his blood as a weapon.
For the first time in history, a human being has defeated a BT.
The Stranding also drags this crazy ghost soldier, played by Mads Mikkelsen, back from hell, and he hunts you throughout the game. And then on top of all of this, you're also fighting against roving bands of terrorists who call themselves Homo Demons, whose motivations provide the major villain arc of the game. Even with all this explanation, there's still some stuff I'm leaving out. The bottom line is, this is a big game with a lot of big themes. It's very likely that later I'm going to put out another video exploring the various instances of symbolism in this game, as many words and phrases are taken from multiple meanings, like strand, for example. But for now, I want to focus strictly on what links to sound design and music. So for our purposes, there's 4 big overarching narrative threads. The expedition from the East Coast to the West Coast, your battle against rogue human elements, your duels against the ghost veteran, who we later find is named Cliff Unger, and the supernatural Death Stranding, what it is, and how to make it stop. Each of these 4 disasters explores a different type of catastrophe, but all of them link to our understanding of disasters in the real world. So as you're probably gathering by now, there's a lot of moving parts in Death Stranding's story, but reducing it down to these 4 primary components makes it easier to talk about. And since each of these plot threads is so distinct, we'll talk about all of them, in order of most grounded to craziest.
I'm telling you, it's like a game.
Your first and primary mission in the game is rebuilding the UCA, which constitutes traveling across the country, delivering cargo, and linking its estranged residents via the Cupid, a device which functions on what they call the chiral network. The chiral network uses an element called CHIRALIUM in the atmosphere, which is typically found on the beach, but because of the Death Stranding, it's all mixed up now. That means that while you're adventuring across the world, you have to brave things like timefall and BTs. It's no wonder that nobody goes outside. Sam's journey is dangerous, and it's mostly his burden to bear alone. In the world of the Death Stranding, delivery people, or porters, are heroes that perform the important task of connecting people who can't, or shouldn't, do it themselves. Now, is this all sounding familiar? Like maybe it was inspired by current events? Well, guess what? Death Stranding came out in late 2019. That's right, for all its similarities to our current pandemic predicament, Death Stranding actually predated it completely, leading many people to compare it to one of Kojima's previous video games, Metal Gear Solid 2, in that they both predicted situations that would come in the near future after the game was actually made. The difference between a ghostly apocalypse and a viral pandemic, of course, notwithstanding. Let's discuss the main journey first, the actual trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. We'll leave the insanity that frequently interrupts the trip for later. But since this is such an eclectic soundtrack, drawing from so many different genres and moods, I first want to give you a broad overview of the central soundtrack, which I think is ironically the least discussed part of the game. Let's talk about the main composers for the game, Joel Korelitz and Ludwig Forssell, a composer at Kojima Productions who had previously worked with Kojima on Metal Gear Solid 5. Kojima didn't give the two of them a ton of direction. He basically told them his general idea, gave them the score of the movie It Follows, and they went on their way. He wanted something unlike anything that had come before, so Korelitz and Forssell went to hardware stores and bought everything from rubber mallets to metal ventilation to paint cans to pieces of wood, and over the course of 3 days they just experimented. One of the central things that was done was the creation of a specially prepared piano. For those watching this unfamiliar, this was an innovation of John Cage, a famous avant-garde composer notable for his radical ideas on the relationship between sound, space, and the observer. You take a piano, you stick all kinds of crap in it, and then when you hit it and play it in different ways, it sounds different. So essentially, Correlates took these percussive, avant-garde acoustic sounds and wrote music out of them, and the soundscape ended up being a duality of things. On the one hand, synthesized tracks from Forcell. On the other hand, more avant-garde horror-esque compositions from Correlates. These two guys set out to capture the realistic and supernatural elements of the game in equal parts. To make the music even more unique, the game used a third-party audio engine that did some procedural generation, i.e. reactive to the gameplay, to build out a system that was meant to keep the score unique. Forcell's feeling was that all the different tracks in their pot of sounds should all work together, whatever the order. Whether you're an avid gamer like me, or have never played a game in your life, if the process I'm describing to you right now sounds unique, it is. But then again, Kojima's ultimate goal with this game was the creation of a brand new genre, which he titled Strand Game. But like anything extremely avant-garde, only some people really saw the vision, while others dismissed it entirely. But the bottom line is, this was an extremely unique score. Because of its conglomeration of unrecognizable acoustic noises and a variety of synthesizers, it's difficult to talk about the score strictly in terms of instrumentation. As we look at examples, I'll probably describe a lot of things as unrecognizable or undefined, and when I do, know that it was an intentional decision for the game.
Hard to imagine it now.
Anyway, when we think of disaster, we often think of violent storms or world-ending conflicts, or even prophetic apocalypses, and believe me, we will talk about those conceptions of disaster. But Death Stranding's central premise touches on disaster in a very different modern way. A lack of human contact.
Thank you.
Our society thrives on interconnectedness, exchange of information, and interaction with each other. Death Stranding imagines a future where the apocalypse didn't happen because everyone died or turned into zombies. You're even told during the game that people have plenty to eat and drink. There's no shortages of anything. People are doomed because intimacy and socializing are things of the past. After all, for society in the basest sense to die, wouldn't humans only have to stop being social?
So take your Cupid and fuck off.
The primary mechanic of the game centers around running and building your way through the world. You're tasked mainly with getting from point A to point B, and how you do that is up to you. As you progress, you get a wide range of tools, ranging from fairly basic things like ladders and climbing anchors, to far-out science fiction stuff like floating carriers, super-powered exoskeletons, or laser-guided ziplines. But through it all, the basic premise remains. You're alone. The irony is, you're on a quest to reunite the country. Reflecting on how wide the range of real-world responses to COVID has been, since our current disaster is, much like Death Stranding, one of isolation and refuge, people have chosen to respond in every way from humor to elegies and tribute videos. Death Stranding's music handles this disaster mostly by emphasizing this atmosphere of solitude and introspection, but simultaneously encourages the player to find hope in the seemingly hopeless, as it seems that many musicians have sought to get people to do in recent months.
Challenging you to find hope amid their hopelessness.
To look at how it does that, we first need to look at the use of space and silence in music as a legitimate compositional tool. In video games, the absence of music is a deliberate choice. When we look at most older games of the 80s and 90s, background music is consistently there. Back then, games were too primitive to depict everything visually, and instead had to use music to help create the appropriate atmosphere. Nowadays, though, many games look better than real life, and in recent years, in-game silence, which we call diegetic, has become a prominent means of immersion, especially where solitude or the natural world is concerned, as I've mentioned in previous videos. While traversing the world, you mostly do so with no acoustic backdrop other than that of nature. What purpose has silence in games served in the past? Well, as some games became more realistic around the turn of the century, some made the choice not to use music for a variety of reasons. Grand Theft Auto games, for example, aim for at least aesthetic realism, and we don't hear music running around in real life. Games in the Soulsborne series sit somewhere between dark fantasy and Lovecraft-style horror, and so use the silence more for atmosphere and effect. Shadow of the Colossus uses it to highlight the in-game encounters with your eponymous foes and make them even more impactful and larger than life. So what purpose does it serve here? Well, there's elements of a few approaches. Much like GTA, the game is set in a somewhat realistic vision of our future. But, like Shadow, your journeys are often interrupted with more action-oriented encounters. So the silence around them on the basic level serves to create the lowest point of the game's overarching dynamic arc. In game music, the thing that immediately sets it apart as a genre is its ability to grow and evolve in accordance with player input. This sets it apart from movie scores or albums that are going to play from beginning to end the exact same way every time. No two playthroughs of a game are ever going to sound the exact same from beginning to end. For this reason, much the same way a good song has highs and lows and segments bridging them, Death Stranding makes use of that same type of dynamic progression, and puts it together with repeated gameplay rituals that help to emphasize this very COVID-esque idea of finding hope within the hopeless. Let's examine a couple in-game examples. At several points during trips, the game will queue up one of several tunes included that will gradually unlock as you progress. It's worth noting that during your traversal segments, especially early on, it's rough going. Sam gets swept over by waves, falls down mountains, stumbles over himself, gets chased around and attacked by renegade porters, carries cargo stacked so high he falls over, and all for no personal gain to himself.
You're kidding me. You actually went into that hellhole. You don't know what this means to me.
Many players have noted their personal difficulty in simply getting Sam through the world. But this was a very conscious decision on Kojima's part, and one that's even depicted in Death Stranding's early trailers.
Fractured our society.
Unlike previous Kojima protagonists, Sam is not a badass. He's not a world-class war veteran and espionage agent, or the latest vampire hunter in a dynasty who was passed down a magic whip. He's a regular guy that just so happens to be good at delivering packages. So what seems like a simple walking trip is often something that involves a lot of careful thought, planning, and some creative use of your items. It's like one big, tricky puzzle to get through the world. So when you finally make it over that big mountain crawling with BTs, and you're in the home stretch of your current delivery run, or you've rebuilt that road after so many hours and you're driving in style to the next town, these moments are quiet victories, but immensely satisfying. It's often in these earned moments of triumph that the songs will start playing. After all that silence and struggle, even the saddest or most reserved song would be rousing. It melds perfectly with not only the gameplay, in that you've solved the puzzle and now it's easy going, but with mood and story as well. Your journey is tough, the task seems impossible, and the world is cold, lonely, and hostile, but you persevere. And in these moments, you're the only one there to celebrate your wins. The camera will often even zoom out during these segments and take full advantage of these beautiful, sweeping landscape shots. And all of a sudden, this cold and twisted world starts to seem beautiful. Even after all that, there's hope. You didn't give up, you made it over the hump, sometimes literally, and victory is in sight. Indeed, although you're physically alone, the central game mechanic is the idea that you're cooperating with other players. The things you build or place in the world can help other people too, and so often, you and many other players are inadvertently working together to get through the world, and as you progress, the landscape will become dotted with zip lines, bridges, generators, watchtowers, vehicles, climbing anchors, and whatever else. There's even this button you can press that lets you call out into the ether, and the voice of Sam, presumably another player's Sam in another reality, will respond to you if you're nearby enough. It's this asynchronous cooperative element that makes the game unique, and led Kojima to describe it as a new genre. You may look like you're alone, but you're really not. So we can see that the core fundamental gameplay reinforces this idea that the licensed music expresses of taking heart and finding the good in the cold loneliness. One of my favorite examples are the few in-person interactions that happen. Since it's dangerous for people to go outside, not just for themselves, but potentially for others, which we'll talk about later, most people don't. So the few times that you have in-person interactions are extremely important moments, rare glimpses of emotion and genuine humanity that serve to remind both Sam and the player why they're undertaking this strenuous adventure in the first place. Part of why these moments hit so hard is because they take advantage of a very basic element of musical theory: tonality.
Thanks, Bridges.
I can't believe
Recall that I explained the game's sound was often made purposely indistinct, in line with its distorted, broken world. In these moments of emotion, sound will often congeal into more recognizable harmonies and melodic ideas, sometimes even keys. It's a simple but powerful way to further solidify these instances as the moments that give the journey purpose. Everything else might be nebulous, unclear, or scary, but this, humanity, is the home base you're working to rebuild.
I'm ready to pull my weight.
The game even plays a special chime when you come in possession of new items. Game chimes for new items are one of gaming's oldest canons, and always serve the purpose of underscoring a new item get as a small victory. As the game progresses, you frequently don't get a new item until you've already circumvented the situation it would have made easier, and so it's always a sigh of relief for the player. Once again, hope within the hopeless. We see that with the simple use of music, this theme echoes through both the gameplay and the story. So now that we've discussed how the music gets used, let's look at the music itself. The first music placed in the foreground comes from a playlist of licensed songs, an uncommon choice in video games and one that contributes additional meaning to the music, since these songs often have context outside the game and were likely chosen for their thematic similarity rather than literal connection. So here's a few seconds of the first song, Don't Be So Serious, by Low Roar. And based on what we've talked about, and even just what you see on screen here, it sounds appropriate, right? But let's dive into just where this soundscape came from, because there's a lot of history here. Honestly, I don't even know if Kojima fully knew just how perfect this music was for his game when he approached Low Roar about it. To begin with, Low Roar is fronted by Ryan Joseph Karazija, who before he started it, had headed an Oakland-based band called Audrey Sessions. Sessions had specialized in guitar-powered pop that fell somewhere between the thematic stylings of U2 and Radiohead. In fact, Karazija himself cited Tom York, Radiohead's lead singer, as a main inspiration of his. Now, if we look at late 20th and early 21st century Radiohead, it's easy to see how their themes and sounds would influence the direction Audrey Sessions, Low Roar, and I'm sure many other alt-rock bands throughout the 21st century would take. If you want an album that matches the Death Stranding aesthetic, you look no further than OK Computer. In this album, Radiohead explored many of the themes that would come to dominate this game, including alienation from others in the world, technology eclipsing interpersonal connection, and an overall feeling of introspection and longing. You know, given this rep as direct inspiration, it's no wonder that Kojima took to Low Roar's music so well when he first happened across it in a record store in Reykjavik. According to Karazija himself, the plaintive, somber sound of the band came from his own feelings of loneliness and change moving out to Iceland, and the challenges of adjusting to life in a strange new country. So not only does Low Roar's sound harken directly back to an album that you can pretty much draw a straight line to Death Stranding, but its own unique sound world also matches the game's, enough for its writer, director, and designer to want to work directly with them. Spin's August 1997 issue had a short piece about OK Computer that captures exactly the way I felt about it. They called it a DIY electronica album with guitars, and said that the result wasn't political, only vaguely social, but it felt utterly contemporary, and I feel like there's no better way to describe it. The world of OK Computer is sanitized, polished dystopian modernism, and it'd be easier to talk about what parts of the alt-rock scene weren't influenced by it. So the attitudes that drew Kojima to Low Roar's sound for this game could feasibly be traced back to this point. Indulge me a little bit. Let's go a little bit further down the rabbit hole. What inspired Radiohead to make their album sound this way? Tom York literally described it as just the noise going on in my head in an interview, and the sources he cited didn't seem all that connected. Johnny even said the album was too garbled and disjointed to sum up. The closest thing to a unifying characteristic that they gave was the atmospheric, atonal weird stuff. And under this docket, they cited the works of composer Ennio Morricone, and especially the sound of Miles Davis's Bitches Brew, for example. No doubt these enigmatic answers frustrated some people, but really, what would you expect from such an enigmatic album? What's really interesting to me though, and what I think we can observe with the atmosphere of this album, which is what York constantly stressed was important to him in interviews, were the philosophical implications of it. During interviews, Tom mentioned a friend of his who likened his experience of the album to the Luddites. He drew the connection on the grounds that they were protesting against the dehumanization of production. People were basically just becoming machinery, and what's easier to replace than machinery? Now, right there, that's literally the theme of the rogue human factions called mules, which we'll talk about later. But his friend likening the album to this particular historical instance says a lot about the themes of dehumanization and depersonalization of the album, and also this game. Now, let's talk about another big philosophical influence. Tom York mentioned the book Valis by renowned science fiction author Philip K. Dick. If you've been here on the channel or listened to the album, you know I myself am a fan of his works. This particular novel depicts an analogous connection between America and the Roman Empire, suggesting imminent fall. Hubris Before the Fall is one of the oldest canons in both literature and real life, and is certainly a component to this game. Technology, much like Icarus, one of literature's best remembered examples, went too far, and while it may not have directly caused the stranding, society's overdependence on it certainly didn't help the situation. OK Computer and the new wave of thought it initiated evolved out of centuries of musing on the human nature. Okay, we gotta stop somewhere. We could literally go down the rabbit hole until we reach Wonderland, especially with the myriad influences that Radiohead had on this album, ranging from Louis Armstrong to Noam Chomsky. But I really just wanted to run down the most pertinent thematic aspects of OK Computer, because it's a pretty straight line. OK Computer was the start of a whole new wave of postmodernist, information era, alienation aesthetic. And when you look at Death Stranding, it's clear to see where and how this stuff originated. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the use of this kind of sound within the game. We've mentioned hope and the hopeless a bit, but let's go a step further. Kojima is well known for hidden recurring symbols and messages in his games. Here's a pretty insane example. Sam's sister Amelie, who often reaches out to Sam in his sleep via the beach, is wearing an ancient method of communication called a quipu, which becomes a pretty major plot point later in the game. Aside from being visually parallel to the Cupid, whose lettering and syllables are like a reversal of quipu, and whose existence and function is representative of reconnecting humanity, it's presented as a symbol of the bond between Sam and his sister. That bond ends up being the thing that saves the world at the end of the journey.
Then how about I add another knot every time I see you?
It turns out that Amelie is actually this godlike being called an extinction entity, whose destiny is to cause the next major extinction event, and her version of the beach is where she initiates the inevitable end of the world, also known as the Death Stranding. But a Russian gamer named Nicholas Samborsky, who has way too keen an eye for this stuff, analyzed the pattern on the quipu before the game even came out and deciphered that its knots in music box form spelled out the melody to another low roar song called Give Me an Answer. Okay, I didn't even know this, but it does make sense. In this way, low roar's music literally becomes hope within the hopeless. Amelie is the unwilling extinction entity, and the fact that her quipu is a symbolic representation of her and Sam's bond, while also being a physical representation of a low roar song, further reinforces the use of their music in this game as a means of giving the player a bright spot in the dark, or in this case, one final chance at the edge of oblivion. So with these examples, we can see that even the main narrative, which doesn't use as much music as the subplots, still made some clever decisions to put the player directly into Sam's blood-soaked, beaten-up boots. You are the last hope, and no matter how hard it gets, no matter how lonely you are, there's always a chance. It's an appropriate theme lately, yeah? Moving on to the next plot thread, and likely your most common nuisance through this game, rogue humans. This is a big theme in a lot of disaster sci-fi, the idea that in the wake of total societal collapse, some humans are bound to become, quote-unquote, uncivilized. Death Stranding's not your typical sci-fi tale, but nonetheless, there's a cool spin to be found on this concept. The Death Stranding was, as you might gather from the advanced tech in the game, preceded by a period of immense technological growth. Drones and robots put a lot of people, especially porters, out of work, so the government basically gave them fake delivery work to placate them, but the knowledge that the world was running on robots basically drove them crazy, turning them into delivery junkies called mules. Because mules are hooked on delivery, as soon as their scanners detect you, all of them within range will charge you with the goal of stealing your cargo and knocking you out. And because they're all over the world, you'll frequently find yourself either sneaking past them or fighting them off. So there's a few things at work here with the mules, right? The game doesn't really portray them as villains so much as the unfortunate result of an impersonal society gone overboard. The game will actually describe them as dopamine addicts, constantly chasing a high that they can only get from deliveries. If we think of Sam as representing a promising future and the possibility of rebuilding a livable world, the mules represent the UCA's failings and the past very literally chasing you relentlessly. Mules are basically the dark mirror image of the friendly porters that you meet throughout your journey. Even the color scheme matches that idea. Ah, the old red and blue. An old science fiction archetype, with the blue light representing calm or serenity or normal operating state, so on and so forth. Conversely, red often represents agitation or hostility or corruption. Can you even count how many examples there are in both fiction and real life? So making friendly porters white and blue, and making mules black and red, or black and neon orange, is a simple means of conveying who's with you and who's against you. By the time of your first encounter with the mules, most of what you've probably heard as far as synthesized music is pads. Now, how does the music help to differentiate mule encounters from the typical gameplay? How does it help to establish their thematic importance in the game's narrative as a cautionary tale against making society too impersonal and automated? Well, breaking down the mule dynamic musical arc isn't too different from the main east to west journey arc that we looked at earlier. You'll encounter mule bases while adventuring, and so often it'll be in silence. There's a few different sound cues that alert you to the different phases of the encounter. If you get pinged by a scanner, you'll hear this sound effect. It's intense, but not too urgent. When you get pinged, they'll come running to your location. There's two phases to this. If a mule spots you, there's this dramatic sting. Stings of various instrumentations are all through a lot of video games involving stealth, as a means of alerting the player that they've been seen. A fight doesn't actually break out though, until you hear this. This sound is meant to be jarring and a little bit disturbing. At this point, you're actually in conflict with the mules, and depending on whether you already got caught in a BT encounter, this is the first action-oriented conflict you experience in the game. The design of this sound probably impresses on the player both the mule's illness and their hostility. And if that didn't, then the sight of a bunch of guys clad in black wearing electric spears running towards you screaming is probably going to. Like some of the scoring we've talked about, the actual mule battle music follows some clear musical trends. As opposed to pads or sustained chords reflecting calmer story beats, the music here sits on top of a constantly arpeggiated synthesizer pattern. There's no mistaking that you're in a fight at this point. Notably, the mule music contains traces of the closest thing the game has to a main theme, although we might think of it as more of a main motif.
It ain't as simple as it seems.
Thematically, aside from the arpeggiated melody though, the synthesizers here are more pointed. They recall less of a modern musing sound like Radiohead or Animal Collective for example, and more of a retro-futurist sound like Tron, or Stranger Things, or Thor Ragnarok, or, to give you a lesser-known example, the Adult Swim game Headlander. Note that two of these examples intentionally harken back to the retro-futurist aesthetic that was popular in fiction of the late 20th century. Just as the mules are the dark mirror image of porters, the music here uses the same kinds of sounds as the main game, but recontextualizes them and makes them more frantic. In this way, visually the mules are very much a part of the main science fiction story, but thematically they couldn't be more opposed to it. The music helps to cement their presence in the game as a riff on many classic science fiction and retro-futurist takes on social disaster. Once you get into the second half of the game, you start dealing with humans that are actively trying to kill you. Enter the terrorist cell Homo Demons, who are basically out to blow the world to hell just because. And in the twisted world of Death Stranding, all that takes is killing a few people. Let me explain. In this game, since the line between life and death is screwy, when somebody dies, the corpse needs to be cremated immediately, because necrosis attracts BTs. Now, BTs are beings of antimatter, and they come back to our world using corpses as a sort of tracker. If they manage to eat a living human, the soul and the antimatter react, and it causes what's known as a void out. Depending on the size of it, a void out can range from a small explosion to a nuke capable of wiping out an entire city. For this reason, everyone is careful to avoid going outside, not just for fear of BTs, but also to avoid potentially becoming a weapon of mass destruction. Science fiction often explores the idea of humans being the greatest danger to themselves, or the idea of kicking off the apocalypse with nukes, and in an extremely creative way, Death Stranding explores both those ideas together.
Doubt I need to say it, but killing is off the table. More corpses means more BTs and potentially more void outs.
The Death Stranding started off with a series of huge void outs that poked the world full of craters. Naturally, everyone's immediate thought was nuclear apocalypse, but as time went on, they found out it was something far more sinister.
As you can see, the Death Stranding poked us full of holes.
Of course, most people didn't want to cause any more destruction, but the demons and their leader Higgs, played by Troy Baker, want to cause even more destruction because they perceive an inevitability about the extinction of all life on Earth.
I got the whole world in the palm of my hands.
While there have only been 2 uses of the nuclear bomb in human history, I dare to say it's probably one of the best represented acts of war in music of all time. There's so much repertoire on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it makes your head spin, but the enormity of the attack is almost incomprehensible, so it makes sense. There's so many musical ways to represent the panic and horror and awful might of the bomb, but since bombs in the world of Death Stranding come in the form of ghosts and dead bodies, it's a very different kind of horror. Take this opening scene, where Higgs, using his Doom's affliction, summons this enormous BT who devours your human companion Igor. At this point, you have no idea what's going on, but you hear this sound somewhat reminiscent of an air raid siren before the blast. This usage of indistinct sound qualities just adds to the fear and confusion of this scene. Talking about this sort of disaster, the man-made kind, gives us a good opportunity to return to the idea of silence. Silence is often reverence. We take a moment of silence when giving memorial to the fallen, so it's interesting and appropriate that void outs in the game are followed up by a period of silence. Especially since the circumstances in which you create a void out in the game are complete chaos. BTs gang up on you, they drag you around and make you drop all your cargo, and then a large one just eats you. As you may have guessed, Corlitz composed the BT battle music, and so it's always this completely frenzied combination of all these insane sounds. Between all that and the shock of plunging into the waters of the beach and repatriating, the ensuing blast of light and silence as you look at this crater are especially effective. The idea of the nuclear bomb being the ultimate example of man-made disaster and destruction serves as a perfect segue into our third main plotline, which is probably my personal favorite. The guerrilla-style duels you engage in throughout the game with the mysterious ghostly combat veteran, or Cliff Unger. Anyone familiar with Kojima's work is probably familiar with Metal Gear, the sprawling, twisting and turning, fourth wall breaking, tongue-in-cheek but totally serious franchise that cemented Kojima as a household name. With its many entries, he explored lots of different themes, but the psychology and philosophy of war are a big focus. War in Kojima's worlds is an increasingly ugly thing. In Metal Gear Solid 4, future wars were fought by proxy armies who contracted to mercenaries, essentially making soldiers blameless pawns. In the games, you're often given a choice between a lethal and non-lethal approach. There's a running theme in the games that, if you choose to kill, eventually you have to face the consequences. So a lot of his games ask, can there really be any ultimate point to all the death caused by war? It's interesting that in his first major game after his split from Konami, with whom he worked for many years, Kojima placed so few references to his major claim to fame. When you battle Higgs at the end of the game, it's a very clear reference to both Metal Gear Solid 3 and 4's final bosses. Two iconic confrontations, which many people rank among their best final bosses of all time. So the references are there. And so naturally, when I saw Cliff Unger appear as a combat veteran, my interest was piqued. I thought to myself, this is an idea Kojima's explored many times. A government agent estranged from or wronged by his government. What kind of insane spin is this game going to put on that idea? Where Metal Gear games ask you to face the ghosts of your actions, Death Stranding asks you to face the ghosts of all the collective war of the last 110 years. Cliff engages you a few times through the game by drawing you into this war-torn dimension, which we later find out is a beach. Another one of your supporting members, Dr. Hartman, later explains to you that when many people die at the same time, like during a war, the collective consciousness sometimes creates a beach in and of itself.
A collective purgatory for an army of the damned.
Cliff, for reasons initially unknown, had the willpower to drag himself back from hell and bring some of that hell with him. The first time it happens, I'm not exaggerating when I say that this was one of the most jarring things in any game I've ever played. You have no idea where you are, why you're there, or who this man is who's suddenly leading a legion of scary but pretty awesome ghost soldiers to kill you. The explosions, gunfire, tanks, and swooping planes are sensory overload after the relative quiet of your overworld exploration. Correlate's crazy score, which in some parts of the game, like here, more resembles disturbing ambient sounds, only adds to the disorientation. In being thrown into this surrealist battle zone with no clear way home and ghosts coming to kill you, this sequence is downright terrifying the first time. The gameplay and music, as always, work together here. We've already talked about how lethal force is a no-no, lest you inadvertently summon BTs and cause a void out. That goes for you too. When you fight the mules, the big dilemma early on is how you're supposed to fight them non-lethally. As you progress, people you've helped will build non-lethal weaponry that makes the task easier, but eventually you start packing real heat, and the game leaves it up to your personal restraint not to kill. But here, all of a sudden, the gameplay changes entirely and becomes something of a tactical shooter with some stealth elements. You're not solving puzzles to get across the world, or sneaking through an enemy camp, or evading or repelling ghostly monsters. You're locked in an inescapable firefight in the middle of a hellish battlefield against ghost soldiers who are out solely to gun you down, and you had better gun them down first. So if you're like me, shooting these guys feels wrong. After all, the narrative of the game thus far has reinforced that you shouldn't be doing that. But you have no choice. You need to kill these guys to move on. This cognitive dissonance and horrific backdrop would be enough to rattle anyone. But just to drive one more nail in the coffin where you lay your sanity to rest, the soundtrack during these fights also changes completely. Gone are the gentle pads, alt-rock stylings, and 80s retro-futuristic synths of the main game. Replacing them is this driving atonal track full of deep, chant-like sounds that I thought were vocals, but could really be anything. When we think of chants, it's easy to draw connections to religion. There are innumerable religions that make use of chants in liturgy or everyday practice. In the face of natural disasters, religion and its musical traditions are a common source of comfort and strength. More on that when we talk about Final Fantasy X. But this is not a religious game in any way. In fact, the existence of things like BTs in the world of the dead seems to suggest that many existing ideas of religion became invalid in Death Stranding's world. The chanting here takes on a much more ominous aspect, and as opposed to a hymn sung by choristers or a heavenly requiem, it's shouting. Instead of high, it's low. Instead of heaven, it's hell. More on that in the Doom Eternal video. I'm so excited. This may be a good time to mention that in Death Stranding's more supernatural segments, it starts to take on some horror aspects, hence Kojima's recommendation of It Follows to the composers. Whether the BTs are scary or creepy or just plain gross is up to you, but just the beginning of this first fight against Cliff, when the ghost soldiers drag him up from the tar via tentacles, sets a totally different tone from the game up to that point. So let's look at horror sound design in video games. Coincidentally, when we talk about the origins of horror sound design in video games, we often trace the line back to Silent Hill, a game series owned by, guess who, Konami. What made Silent Hill special was its emphasis on psychological horror rather than more conventional imagery like zombies or mutants. The world of the game played on the protagonist's fears. Just like the titular location blurred the line for the protagonists between reality, nightmare, and psychosis, the sound design would blur the line between sound effects, creatures, and the music itself. Now, besides the fact that Kojima was working at Konami, he was also slated, believe it or not, to create a brand new Silent Hill game, which would have been called Silent Hills, along with renowned fantasy horror director Guillermo del Toro and horror actor Norman Reedus. In August of 2014, PT was released as a playable trailer for the game. It was lauded for its direction in video game horror, but tragically, the game was cancelled and PT was yanked from the PlayStation Store, so you'd have a beast of a time trying to play it now. Now this is an aside, but can you imagine a master director of cerebral and psychological storylines and complex characters teaming up with an iconic horror and creature design visionary and an extremely talented actor creating an entry in one of the most seminal horror series of all time? Can you imagine how it would have turned out? Come on, Konami. But, let me not complain too much. Because despite what people said, this game was awesome. Take it from me. Yeah, it's tragic that Silent Hills was cancelled, but it may have informed Kojima's decision to go his own way. And certain elements of the cancelled Silent Hills, like aesthetics and collaboration with Del Toro and Reedus, were carried over into Death Stranding. So it wasn't a total loss. So the reason I'm giving you this abridged Konami horror sound design history lesson is because this game frequently employs that strategy. At many points, the game deliberately blurs the line between BTs or other ghosts, ambient or environmental sound effects, and the music itself. It's an aesthetic that, even though there's precedent for it in games, I wasn't used to. So during the duels against Cliff, when this music comes on, the brain easily draws a line between this hellish chant-like sound and the ghost soldiers all around you. These battlefields are basically the collective fury of everyone who died in combat, and as we've talked about in Kojima's worlds, the death is often needless. Many cultures have viewed war variously as a glorious pursuit or an inevitable part of human nature, but here, it's certainly a disaster. A microcosm of a larger, impending extinction event, the largest disaster of all. But compare this chanting to the music that gets used to introduce Cliff himself. Strings in Death Stranding are used sparsely, for one of two reasons: dramatic, climactic encounters, or emotional moments. Sometimes both. When Cliff gets this close-up, the horror underpinnings disappear, and what we get instead is this wistful music. Does this sound like the music of a villain? You start to ask yourself, who is culpable in war? Those who fight, or those who send others to fight? If this backdrop is the embodiment of the disaster of war, then soldiers themselves are just as much victims as anyone. Once again, to me this recalled Metal Gear Solid 4, and its extensive use of strings in its main theme. Metal Gear Solid 4 took place in a cold future, where war was tragic, impersonal, and ultimately pointless. And this aching, longing theme really served to drive that home. Now remember, the Metal Gear Solid games were Kojima's babies, and so it's not a leap to liken themes in those games to Death Stranding. And indeed, as Cliff's backstory is further fleshed out, and his current incarnation and original incarnation are eventually linked via flashbacks, we find that Cliff may just be the most sympathetic character of everyone. Another victim subject to the effects of two disasters, the war that sent him to hell, and the Death Stranding that dragged him back. So this finally brings us to our last narrative thread, the Death Stranding itself. Now, this is the first narrative thread to actually get introduced, even before the main quest, but it's the last one that actually gets resolved, and since it serves as both a prelude and a finale, I wanted to leave it for last in our discussion, because it makes use of several of the sound design elements we've discussed individually so far. To begin with, let's return to this insane scene at the beginning when the first void out occurred. This is your first major story-related event, and the sound design here really makes an impression. I still don't know what those sound effects are. Were they environmental, like a town nearby saw a void out was about to happen, and so they sounded a siren? What about the ominous undercurrent? How much of this was music, and how much was coming from the creature? The siren has characteristics vaguely reminiscent of the human voice. It really sets the precedent for the blurred lines that define not only the sound design of the game's more supernatural aspects, but indeed the boundary between life and death in the world of Death Stranding. It's worth mentioning that when you finally confront this BT Colossus at the end of the game, as part 1 of the battle against Higgs, its roars and cries are this eerie, alien, and absurdly cool mixture of vocals, synthesized tones, and sound effects. The fight definitely takes on some horror aspects, and the build-up and lead into the fight is actually terrifying. But anyway, the first void out is just the prelude to the title screen, which appears while Sam is standing on the beach for the first time. He wakes up with the BB he died in connection with, looks up at the sky, and there's this mysterious shot of 5 ghosts hovering in the air. If it wasn't for the musical sting at this part, you probably wouldn't think that this was any more or less significant than any of the other unexplained stuff you'd seen in the previous 40 minutes. But the sting suggests that you're bearing witness to something pretty major. There's a very dissonant harmony which is voiced in such a way that it sounds to be leading into something. It's an indistinct blend of many sounds. In some ominous, creepy, foreboding way, this is one of the scariest scenes in the game to me. You've probably been playing for less than an hour now, but hearing that sting and seeing this bleak, despondent title screen, you know. The Death Stranding is a mysterious and dark event, and you have to stop it. Bar none, Death Stranding's opening sequence is the most insane I have ever seen in a video game. Yeah, everything you see gets explained eventually, but the fact that the game hits you with all its cryptic mythology right out of the gate, all at once, is more than you could possibly be prepared for. But it sets the stage for the game perfectly. It establishes the Death Stranding as this mysterious and somewhat incomprehensible event, and it sets the tone for the ultimately undefined sound design that would permeate the whole game. Now let's talk about how this narrative thread evolves musically at the finale. For those who don't play video games, I want to first clarify that in most adventure games like this, there is no time limit imposed on the player. Even if the narrative of the game dictates that your protagonist has limited time to solve the problem, as this one does, often the game will not actually limit your time. There are a few significant exceptions to this rule, most notably Majora's Mask, which we're also going to be talking about in this series, but in this game, even though the Death Stranding is described as an accelerating event and you don't have much time to stop it, you as the player can take your time. Once you reach the end of the game though, that all goes out the window. In a nutshell, the Death Stranding is a ghostly apocalypse. In the sections where the Death Stranding itself is the focal point, the sound shifts from emphasizing these more human aspects, i.e. the main quest and rogue human arcs we talked about earlier, to the panic and uncertainty associated with any large-scale disaster, especially an extinction level one involving ghosts. BTs will start appearing unprompted all over the world, and when you finally arrive at your destination, you're faced with what many people describe as the final boss, a giant whale-shaped BT. This is the biggest and most imposing enemy you fight. Appropriately, the music here is unique and unites a few sound design aspects that had largely been distinct. If one side of the apocalypse is destruction, the other side has more to do with the religious aspect. Nowadays, choral music is more used for dramatic effect than anything else, but for many years, and even now, in more careful considerations of how to do sound design, it has some religious connotation to it. Now, I don't mean in the sense of like organized religions like Christianity or Judaism, for example, but I do mean in the sense of mythology. The idea of an above or a below is an archetypal thing in many works of fiction and art, video games, movies, including this one. Again, no religion ever comes into play here, but this idea of an above and a below works well together with choral music. We saw it once with the Ghost Soldiers. Now, let's look at it again here. So we talked about alt-rock and electronic music and how it helps to establish the main premise of the game. We talked about horror sound design and how it helps to juxtapose this premise against the broader, more sinister truth of the Stranding itself. We talked about judicious use of strings in the game and how their presence created a totally new atmosphere. Now, during this whale fight, which is nicknamed just that since the enemy is never explicitly named, the game has built to a fever pitch. The color scheme itself has changed. There is no doubt about it. The sixth extinction is nigh, and it's do or die. The music during this battle is surreal in the context of the game, because it's set in the real world, but the music makes heavy use of vocal and string elements which, up to that point, had been reserved for special situations or battles in other planes of existence. Their appearance here, and the dramatic soaring nature of the melody, serves to further inform the player of the state of the world. This extinction, i.e. the apocalypse in the context of the game, is imminent, and the chorus plays on this archetypal idea of mythology, and the below emerging to swallow up the world. Just as the conclusion of the Death Stranding is about to erase the line between life and death entirely, and BTs overflow into our world, so too are different musical spheres melded together and spilling over into each other in the music here. So evaluating all of this, it's not so easy to sum Death Stranding up or to neatly put it in a box. There's not any clean, easy way I could say everything about this game all in a couple sentences. But to recall our initial purpose in doing all this, to examine the real-world roots of the soundtrack/sound design, and how it helps bridge the gameplay with the real-world themes, it's plain to see that all of the game's various soundscapes were carefully crafted. And in each case, the context of the music either gave us additional information or helped reinforce the game's imagery. The licensed music very plainly hailed from a realm matching the game's more human themes, and synthesizers served to underscore the science fiction aspects. Meanwhile, man-made disasters like war and bombing are mused on with sound reflecting hellish pain, and the supernatural occurrences are undergirded with scores evoking archetypal themes of the end of the world. It should come as no surprise that a game dealing with such a wide range of issues would employ such a huge variety in sound. But whether you view Death Stranding as a commentary on current social issues, technological overabundance, the evils of war, or a prophetic apocalypse, the music is there to match it, and help to connect the crazy story beats to the real world. It would be easier to talk about the ideas of disaster that weren't touched on in this game. It makes me feel like I should have done this one last instead of first. Ah well. Stay tuned for part 2, and we'll talk about the apocalyptic choral music and extreme metal that came together to form the abomination that is Doom Eternal. You're not going to want to miss that one.